When you're done working on a comp, you're going to want to convert it into a kind of file that people can view. You do that by rendering it. And there are two ways to render it. You can render it using the render queue or using the Adobe Media Encoder. We're going to focus on the render queue in this lesson. I cover the Adobe Media Encoder in a separate lesson, during which I do kind of a side-by-side comparison of the render queue and the Media Encoder with a focus on the Media Encoder. So to see how the render queue works here, let's go to Working Files, go over to After Effects Projects, and scroll on down here to 2202 Rendering. Now just a reminder, you render a comp, not a project. So in this case, you need to select the comp that you want to render. We have three different comps here. We're going to focus on this first one here, Fish and Bubbles. So it's selected. It's active here in the timeline panel. It can also be selected up here. Right now I've got two selected, Reflections and Fish and Bubbles. If I were to make this active, then the Reflections would become the active comp. So down here, Fish and Bubbles is active. Here it's Reflections. So just to make sure nothing goes wrong here, I'm going to click on Fish and Bubbles so it's active in both places. And now I go up to Composition, and I choose Add to Render Queue. Click on that. That opens up the render queue down here in the timeline panel with this comp active. There are three things you want to focus on here: Render Settings, Output Module, and then Output To. The general workflow is to pick the Output Module first. I'm going to click on this disclosure triangle to show you the current settings. Right now AVI is selected because that's the default here in Windows. And anything that you want to change, you would change by clicking on this hot link here. But this is the current set of settings right there. And basically it's the same settings as the comp. I'm going to close this down and open up the module itself by closing that disclosure triangle and clicking on this hot link there. And we're going to look at the various formats. This is where you change to a different file type. Click this drop down arrow there. If we want to go to something else, for example, like QuickTime, this is where we'd go there. Now take a look. You'll notice that some things are not here that you might expect to see here, like H.264 and Windows Media Video, WMV. Those have been switched over to the Adobe Media Encoder with the Creative Cloud. So you won't find them here. You've got to go to the Adobe Media Encoder to find them. In any event, let's go down to, let's say, QuickTime. Once you pick QuickTime, you need to click on a format option, which is basically the codec, the compression-decompression algorithm. When you look at the codec, there are many codecs here, but you can access the H.264 codec here inside the MOV wrapper, as it's called. So I'm going to click on that. And the rest of the stuff here is pretty straightforward. Selecting the codec is the main thing here. Click OK. Now, if you want to resize it, you can, but you probably are going to go with the current size. If you want to crop it, you can, but you could do that in the comp. What's important is to make sure that you have audio output here. You have it on, auto, or off. Auto is fine. There isn't any audio in this comp, so it's all right, but it's good to know that this is available there. Then you can change the settings here or change the format options. So that's how that works. I'm going to click OK. Then you might want to change the render settings, but you probably won't. Let's just take a look at them first by clicking on this disclosure triangle there. You can see what they are. They basically say what your current comp is. You want the best quality, you want full resolution, you want motion blur on wherever it is currently used in your project, and you want to use the current settings for your color depths. So you probably wouldn't change this, but this is the current set of settings. Let me close this down. So to access those guys, just click on Best Settings here, and this is the Render Settings dialog box, and Best is probably what you want to do. You probably want to use the current settings for the color depth, but you can change that to something else, like you can take it to 16 bits, which is a little bit more, of course. Field render should be off, generally speaking, unless you're interlacing your file, which not many people do anymore these days. Time span is set to the work area, but in case you mistakenly set the work area to something other than the full comp and you want the full comp, you can do that to make sure that you get the full comp. In any event, I click OK now. We've got that set, and it changes to custom now instead of the original best settings. Now you need to say where you're going to save this. So you click on the Output To hot link there. Choose a location, which right now is where the projects are located, which is fine. I'll click Save. And a lot of people go, okay, I'm done now. And then they walk away and get a coffee while they think it's going to render, but it doesn't render until you click on the Render button. So we're going to do that now. And it'll take a little while to render this thing. I'll let you know how long. I'm going to fast forward here now and let you know how long it took. All right, just about wrapped up here. And there you have it. It took 2 minutes and 40 seconds to render that 10-second clip. So 2 minutes and 40 seconds, what is that, 160 seconds? So it's about 16 times longer than the actual clip itself, just to give you a sense of how long it takes to render some things. This is a relatively straightforward comp. Some things can take much longer. Also, the kind of format that you render to has something to do with how long it takes. This one's a relatively time-consuming format. Nevertheless, now that we've waited all this time, let's go take a look at our handiwork. I stored it here in the Working Files After Effects Projects folder. I'll delete it later, but we can look at it now. I'll just double-click on it here. Open up the QuickTime Movie Player. Double-click on this little gray bar to get it up like that. Let's take a look at our 10-second comp here. So there you go. That's how you use the render queue to render comps.